Hi everyone. Good afternoon to all of you, and thanks so much for making the time to be here today. Thanks to Marianne for such a kind welcome. And it's almost coming up to a year that I've joined the School of Business in Maynooth right after my PhD in UCC, as Marianne was mentioning. So, in today's session, I will very much be talking about and talking through all the research that I did during my doctoral journey, some of the work that I was able to publish from it, and the paths that are, incrementally developing through the peer review process in various journal outlets. Um, but at the end of the session, my hope is that everyone will know a little bit more about non-standard employment relationships, particularly platform work, and the opportunities and challenges that platform workers, encounter in exercising voice within these very precarious work arrangements. Um, Now, firstly, I wouldn't want to kind of assume that everyone here is familiar with the term platform work and digital labor platforms, but you'd immediately relate the moment I said Deliveroo or Uber, because many of you would be using these apps, these platforms. For the services that they offer with regards to, say, food delivery or ride hailing. Um, and basically, so platform work is facilitated by these digital labor platform organizations that use algorithms to connect customers to service providing self-employed freelancers or contractors. And it's on an on-demand basis for very short term tasks, which is also known as gigs. So you'd also hear the term gig economy being used quite a bit in the news or in research papers and so on. And in some of these work arrangements, then there might be an additional stakeholder involved, depending on the type of service that the platform is, delivering, which would be a supplier. So in the case of food delivery, you'd see a restaurant or a grocer being involved as well. And now, over the years, there has been quite a few typologies categorizing the different platform work variants. A lot of scholars have come up with different categorizations for platform work, but the International Labour Organization essentially classifies platform work into two main types. The first one that you see is where workers perform their tasks online and remotely through these web-based platforms. And this basically, involves your online freelancing, such as website development, content writing, graphic design, and even shorter digital tasks, which include activities like, taking surveys, image recognition, labeling, transcription, and that's through these platforms like Upwork and Amazon Mechanical Turk. Some of you might also be using these services to collect data for your large-scale quantitative, studies. Um, and the other type then is where workers work on site through these location-based platforms, which are very much situated in the labor market. It is geographically and physically localized, and this then comprises of your ride-hailing, your food delivery, housekeeping, caregiving platforms like Uber, Deliveroo, Helpline, Care.com. Recently, I was reading a Guardian article that it's supposed to even expand into healthcare. They were calling the headline in the papers was Uber for nurses. So it's very much expanding, an economy that's expanding. But my own research is very much on the second type, and specifically focusing on food delivery as part of my research. Now, what is worth noting is that platforms classify these workers as self-employed independent contractors in most jurisdictions. In some, a new term or a new classification, that is the worker classification, has been introduced incrementally, but in most jurisdictions at the moment, they're all self-employed. And that basically means that the platform does not have to recognize a traditional employment relationship, and it's kind of essentially exempted from being an employer, and all of this then minimizes any kind of labor costs and liabilities that are associated with being an employer, and includes, things like employment protection, your minimum wage, overtime pay, sick pay, and so on. At the same time, then these workers are also unfortunately excluded from various statutory protections and institutional voice representation structures, such as your trade unions, collective bargaining, across all these jurisdictions. And so, given my interest in voice, and I was in the early days navigating the voice scholarship, I realized that um, the discourse had been very much preoccupied with the employee and the standard employment relationship and the facilitation of the employee's voice through various direct and indirect channels that you have, such as your speak up programs, your open door policies, suggestion schemes, employee surveys, grievance processes, unions, works council, you name it, basically, which then leaves workers who are in these non-traditional employment relationships entirely excluded from both the conceptual as well as the practical scope. And this then creates challenges for, I guess, the preservation of fundamental human rights such as freedom of association, voice, representation at work, which are also integral to the international labor standards and UN's decent work agenda. So this was very much the premise and the main concern that actually underpins the entirety of my research, where I focused on examining worker voice in relation to the mediating role of algorithms within these work arrangements and how this marginalizes opportunities for voice. Also, then you need to recognize how the value of recognizing and facilitating voice changes from an organizational standpoint too. So it's very much, diminished given the dissolution of the traditional employer-employee relationship and the shift to what is this multi-party transactional work arrangement that you actually see in platform work. And the final concern here is that the workforce that you have engaging in platform work is quite heterogeneous. It's very diversified, and they also lack access to shared workplace or a shop floor, which is traditionally and historically considered a really important spatial setting for the development of worker voice. So then these are some of the main theoretical as well as practical debates that I've contributed to, and I continue to contribute to through some of my both conceptual and empirical work, which I will be discussing in a bit, and is also like the focus of my presentation today. But very broadly, my work to date then examines the expressions and the development of platform worker voice, the emerging opportunities and challenges, and it looks to understand the kind of influence that workers can have in shaping workplace dynamics, and whether this influence is ultimately something that they can sustain or not in the long term. And so then, given the ability of platform workers to be able to express voice is such a core concern, it in the literature and in academic circles, that undoubtedly it kind of generated a lot of interest across disciplines, and there were a lot of research that was published on this, on platform worker organizing, undertaking collective action, which basically suggested that, despite the barriers, workers' voices were far from being suppressed. And so then to navigate this, really huge corpus of literature. I undertook a systematic review. Here, the position that I was holding was, I looked at, HRM's early, very much overlooked radical leanings that were informed by critical IR, sociology of work, labor process traditions, to recognize that due to the indeterminacy of labor power, the potential for and the potential for antagonistic interests within these employment arrangements, work could and can always also manifest as individual and collective forms of worker resistance. And so from this review, I kind of identified motives and channels of voice used by platform workers. And so what you see is the conceptual framework where the first motive and channel is essentially voice for mutual aid, which emerges through digital communication technologies. And this voice for mutual aid essentially arises because of the hyper individualized organization of the workflow. Workers are essentially spatially dispersed, and this basically increases their sense of struggle there and kind of motivates to find other workers, network amongst themselves, build relationships, which the platform through its business model actively tries to discourage. So then studies showed how workers were using various social media based forums, digital communication tools to kind of create online spaces where they could, socialize beyond the confines of, I guess, organizational monitoring and surveillance. And these spaces then, represent or are almost akin to digital water coolers where workers can influence each other as well as, access the voice of other workers. And in the case of, I guess, location-based platforms, these online spaces even spilt over to physical spaces such as your common pickup points or drop-off points, car washes, petrol stations, parking lots and so on in railways and airports. But what was interesting is the phenomena where researchers saying that how these online spaces and communities, they kind of promoted the sense of camaraderie among workers based on their shared struggles, and how these online communities then spontaneously evolved to take the shape of these alternate worker-led organizational forms. And these organizational forms then became new channels through which your voice for organizing emerged. And this is interesting because workers are typically excluded, as I was saying, from formally accessing trade union representation on account of their employment classification. And multiple studies then also show how workers formed associations, micro collectives, and interestingly, these organizational forms, the way they became a channel was by trying to form alliances and coalitions with other unions in the context that have a strong political positioning, or even reaching out to non-labor actors, such as your civil society advocates, your academics, journalists, and even the media. Then to kind of tackle the issue of invisibility, workers also used, various online and offline public spaces to channel and reach the greater general public, and to kind of create that visibility and awareness around their poor working conditions. Again, this is new. This is new and quite novel to use public spaces to escalate voice. Not sure if any of you've come across this in the news, but a very prominent example is the public letter writing campaign that was done by Amazon Mechanical Turk workers. That was directly, it was directed at the CEO, Jeff Bezos, where workers basically called for proper recognition as skilled individuals who kind of, deserve the tools to represent themselves. And, they asked for better access to communication and feedback channels, not just with the platform, but also with task requesters and clients. Um, and with regards to location-based platforms, then there are a lot of examples where workers have, undertaken physical demonstrations, rallies, informal protests in the main streets of the city, outside popular restaurants and company premises. And then final is your voice for confrontation, which basically centers around workers approaching the judicial system of the country using legal action to kind of assert their voice and, contest the platform business model very directly. So workers have kind of pursued strategic litigation, class action suits to kind of influence systemic changes, to push the government to bring about favorable policy supports, to set legal precedents, to regulate platform operations in different jurisdictions. But what's also interesting is that most of these efforts have very much originated from global north countries, where there is a good, strong history of collective bargaining, worker representation. There's presence of comprehensive social welfare systems and essentially labor laws that are very much, designed to safeguard worker rights. So then these findings led me to conceptualize what I kind of call the grassroots voice mechanism, which is constituted by platform workers when their voices are organizationally as well as institutionally unsupported. And this conceptualization, as I argue, kind of adapts and expands the dimensions of voice along the agenda, form, and influence, which was initially proposed by Bruce Kaufman all the way back in 2015, which then shaped 10 years, so a decade of voice scholarship with focus mainly on standard employment relationships. So even the classification of voice as, direct versus indirect, formal versus informal, that has been theorized and used so extensively, I argue it's all from an organizational standpoint rather than that of the workers, which then from the platform work context makes very little sense, because both the institutional as well as the organizational voice structures are absent entirely. And so what you basically see emerging is this grassroots form of voice, which is relational, it is emergent, it is shaped by struggle, it is shaped by agency, community, and context, and it carries this potential to, influence a range of stakeholders. And this is also quite interesting because it then shows that workers are not just, interested in influencing organizational decisions and workplace affairs, but they also want to make changes at a macro level, at an institutional level. And so it's how their voice essentially reaches the public, the legislative authorities, which again takes theorization and the scope of voice well beyond the traditional organizational boundaries. So then this understanding of voice guided my research design, the methodology for my empirical work. I used a qualitative and multi-stakeholder study that was focusing on platform-based food delivery sector, and it involved collecting data through different qualitative methods and across a range of participant groups, as you see, which all of these stakeholders are really important for completion of the delivery workflow. So you have interviews with platform organizational representatives, which is a viewpoint which is which was and is particularly difficult to access, as well as that with couriers, worker activists, restaurants, grocery store owners, managers, customers, in the Irish context, and all of these views were captured through a total of 77 in-depth interviews, 20 hours of participant observation in Cork, and 33 documents. And so then in one of my studies, I have two. In one of my studies, I kind of wanted to validate some of my conceptual work. I wanted to look at how location-based platform workers utilize these different grassroots voice channels, as I theorize, and whether they, face any challenges or not. And I wasn't just randomly querying this. I queried this very much in light of new research that was showing and was starting to recognize this gradual shift in the social composition of the platform workforce, particularly the platform food delivery workforce, showing how workers' nationality, their migrant status, their varying dependencies on platform work, and their legal rights to work within a particular jurisdictional setting was influencing their capacity to exercise voice. Now, what's quite interesting is that my research, it did not start out with a focus on migrant labor, and it wasn't designed purposefully to recruit only migrant couriers. But during the early phases of participant observation, such a composition of the workforce kind of became very apparent. I made a lot of effort to recruit native couriers, but that point in time when I was doing data collection, I wasn't able to. All the couriers that I, interviewed and recruited were migrants from non-EU contexts living in Ireland. Out of the 15, 6 of them had work authorization. That means they were legally allowed to work, while 9 of them were engaging in platform work without work authorization. That is by informally renting work accounts, or, using authorized work accounts that might have been held by a close friend or so, or a relative. Now, from these interviews, then what I gathered was, while social media based messaging and communication tools such as your WhatsApp was widely being used by workers, the very ease of setting up an online network, it led to multiplication of these online worker groups, which essentially meant that workers held multiple memberships simultaneously, and this splintered workers and their voices, instead of containing it in an encompassing network. And as you see from the picture, the figure on the right, there were a lot of groups that operated at a local city level, which offered emergency support to other workers facing on-the-job challenges. But there were others that were, intended for practical exchanges, such as selling bikes, renting accounts, and these groups typically had a greater membership size. But apart from these, then there were also smaller groups that were very much, formed around shared nationalities and common languages. And the general consensus from workers was that they found it hard to navigate the multiple groups for different purposes, and that kind of led to a fragmented experience where workers lost track of conversation and they eventually disengaged. Some of the workers, they naturally gravitated towards the smaller groups because they found it more comfortable based on common language, nationality, and that was for all their interactions and support, which then led to the formation of natural silos, which workers were unable to overcome, despite the fact that they had physical proximity. The work was locally and physically embedded, which you see in across all of these excerpts. And this also presented as a huge challenge for activists who relied on these online groups for organizing these workers. The other issue was that given that workers actually shared their own experiences of platform work and their own experiences of navigating the platform's algorithmic system on these groups, if you read the last excerpt, you can actually see how the opacity of the algorithmic system kind of deprives workers of a systematic understanding of pay, how they are assigned work, and that then interferes with their understanding of shared conditions, which makes it really difficult for them to establish a common ground for moral solidarity, and it kind of further widens the divisions that are already rooted in kind of language and nationality differences, and of course it kind of also undermines any effort that they kind of have made to create support for each other through these groups. Now, with regards to informal unions, so beyond the use of these social media tools, you have the English Language Students' Union of Ireland that was formed, and it came forward to advocate for platform worker rights in public debates in the political arena, essentially. The formation of this union has a very interesting history. So the union had been established in 2020 in response to the uncertainties that were being encountered specifically by non-EU English language students during the COVID-19 pandemic, the lockdown period. And it then very quickly began to organize platform work, as given the substantial overlap between the students who had actually turned to platform-based food delivery via various informal subcontracting practices, because part-time work opportunities kind of drastically shrunk during this particular period. So from speaking to one of the ELSU activists who had an educator background, I found that not only all the work that they did with the workers pro bono, but while ELSU kind of succeeded in gathering support from other unions transnationally, and even drawing initial political attention to platform worker issues within the Irish context, the government had refused to engage with them because they were an informal student union. The government then recommended SIP2 or Unite to get involved. Now, prior to this, ELSU had reached out to both SIP2 and Unite, and they had hesitated. Because it was mostly students working, but then they later agreed. Now, and so once SIP2 got involved, they formally kind of appointed independent organizer from their end to conduct meetings with the workers. And what was interesting, again, that they relied only on English as a sole medium of communication. And as such, another thing that they did was they immediately, after a couple of meetings, they ended up initiating union membership to platform workers, which kind of it did not go down well at all. It generated skepticism and distrust towards the union, and it kind of undermined all of ELSU's previous efforts to actually secure trade union support. So some of the main reasons for this was the differences in political views that were held by, migrant workers, the constant workforce churn, the fact that many of the workers were working without legal authorizations, and that then led to deeper disconnect and fear of being identified, and it kind of altogether undermined the cultivation of political solidarity. What was also interesting then, given that SIP2 decided to sideline ELSU during the organizing process, it could be because of structural and ideological differences, but it also could be seen as a contributing factor. But again, I think it's a kind of a complicated story because you have to also consider Ireland's political landscape. Ireland is essentially a liberal market economy, and this kind of a status is very much less conducive to the strength of its industrial relation systems and capabilities, and proves to be very challenging context for unions in general, which kind of rely on a lot of institutional power. So then you can see from the interviews with platform managers, this is something that they, recognize, and they kind of consider it quite strategically. It kind of reflects in how the platform essentially decides to engage with the workforce in different jurisdiction that it operates in. The excerpt here is quite eye-opening, where you actually see this particular platform having a very differentiated approach to worker representation and voice in other operational contexts, such as the UK, France, Italy, where they are complying with various institutional requirements, or they are voluntarily engaging with trade unions who represent platform worker interests. But then when you come to Ireland, you see no similar efforts for workers in the Irish context. Another thing, I guess, is the fact that, and I guess for argument purposes, you could say that Italy and France, they both share coordinated market economy characteristics in some shape, where platform worker organizing has been union led or either union supported, in case where grassroots and community driven activism has kind of become prominent, and that then eventually was successful in influencing state intervention. But if you look at the UK case, for example, UK kind of shares similarities with Ireland, both in terms of the platform workforce composition, but as well as its liberal market economy characteristics. It's quite similar to Ireland. And there again, the platform here in question, initiated a structured engagement with the trade union, that was GMB, by choice. This is quite interesting. Again, to kind of think deeper into why this was possible. So the movements in the UK context was led out by very experienced rank and file unions that had, history of organizing precarious migrant workers, whereas ILSU was quite new into doing all of this. And these unions in the UK context, they actively were involved with a very active network of academics and activists. Strong left-wing political parties were also quite involved, all of which in combination then they lend quite favorably to platform worker solidarity. And all of this, I guess, will become more clear and will start making sense, a bit more sense, I suppose, when I kind of start sharing findings on how platform workers' strikes kind of fared within the Irish context. So workers did use access to their public spaces, city centers, in front of restaurants, to channel their voice and bring more visibility to their struggles. There were a lot of instances where workers had organized city-level strikes and protests in front of popular restaurants in Dublin, in Cork, Galway, Limerick. But none of these strikes essentially scaled, and they did not produce sufficient public support or the visibility that was necessary for government intervention and for institutional level solidarity. In fact, the worker participation levels in these strikes, they kind of reveal quite a few gaps. You see from these excerpts how financial constraints linked to informal subcontracting, where workers have to pay rent for accounts and so on, even their temporal orientations to engage in this kind of work impacts the strike participation level. And all of this then is even slightly more aggravated when they have to kind of come in terms with the retaliation consequences of the platform, where you can see how platforms, used various strike break efforts. They offered financial incentives, that is, an extra 10 euro or £10 if workers agreed to work during the duration of the strike to discourage strike participation. And also on the screen on the left, you can see a screen grab of a email that was sent out by the platform to, almost threatening account deactivation. So all of these then kind of generate that fear where they decide not to partake in the strike. But apart from all of this, the other aspect is how workers even perceive support from the local community, which is quite important. And this is all perception based. It's based on some of the workers kind of being, experiencing being attacked or assaulted on their job, and they feel like they don't have sufficient backing from local law enforcement or the Garda. Is when I spoke to some of the customers and the restaurants, I found that they shared awareness of these issues, but they never openly or publicly stated solidarity with platform workers. You can see from the excerpts how one of the owners of a popular restaurant in Dublin shared how the order volumes had completely dropped during the Valentine's Day strike in 2024, which basically meant that customers were very much not ordering food on platforms in solidarity with the strike. But then again, you have another excerpt from the platform, from the customer interviews, which seems slightly apathetic. So all of this then doesn't, you can't make certain generalizable conclusions regarding this, but these are sentiments which very much reflected in how workers perceive support from the local community, which is very well recognized as a key power resource. So all of this then leads to another little bit of conceptualization. And what we then begin to see is that even though different grassroots channels they existed, they did not necessarily support the cultivation or the sustenance of solidarity across these different levels, which is your worksite, the organizational and institutional level, which is very much necessary for the integration of the different channels into a voice mechanism. And there are various individual work environment and regulatory factors that actually hinder the formation of solidarity via these different channels, contributing to, I guess, subpar and a very disconnected utilization of these channels by workers for voice. A key takeaway is that, I suppose, firstly, the fact that we cannot assume that physical proximity would immediately encourage the solidarity building process. So location-based platform workers, despite their local embeddedness, are no less fragmented from online workers who are even further geographically scattered, that are engaging in web-based work, and benefits that might be gained from, I guess, reduced physical isolation can easily be offset by worker subjectivities, various workforce diversification trends, and how the social composition of the workforce that is characterized by migrant status, by workforce churn, is then compounded by the diminished strength of unions, and depending on the context, and also the absence of inclusive institutional protections, which can result in highly unstable solidarities. What you also see is how the failure to establish solidarity at one level could impact other levels, could have a moderating and snowball effect on workers' ability to optimally synergize the different voice channels. And I guess another aspect is the theoretical contribution that of this paper, where I'm trying to conceptualize disconnected voices as a condition where multiple bottom-up channels. They exist, but they fail to integrate due to deficits in moral, political, and performative elements of solidarity. And what is interesting, our novel about this conceptualization is that it kind of will offer understanding into why some platform worker populations struggle to effectively exercise voice despite access to similar channels that have, yielded success in other geographies. And this is really important from a regulatory standpoint, actually, because new regulatory reforms, in order for them to be genuinely inclusive and to not assume uniformity in worker capacities across context, it's important that this is recognized so that and supported, essentially. So then the question of to what extent workers are able to gain influence through their voice over platforms directly, and whether they can sustain this influence, if at all. So this is a different paper altogether. This is using only the platform perspective, and it requires understanding of various acts, both individual as well as collective, which workers enact and use to draw attention to themselves, to make themselves heard, and also how the platforms then react to it. Now, this paper has been recently accepted and will be out to read soon, so I won't go into too much detail. But in here, what's important to understand is that platform workers lack direct access to organizational representatives, and they are restricted very much to the algorithmic interface of the worker app, and the app then basically proxies as a focal point of organizational contact, and platforms algorithmic system becomes a primary target of influence. So whether when workers engage in various individual acts like gaming the system for higher payouts, or collective level acts through which they create effects that produce strike-like effects. What I hear from managers is that there is this ongoing cycle where the platform's algorithmic management practices are continuously evolving in response and actions to both the actions and reactions of the workers as well as that of the platform. And this is very much taking place in a multi-actor environment, which has a shaping effect. So very simply, workers do have the ability to tangibly affect the platform's algorithmic management practices and influence their immediate working conditions, but very much so in the short term. And this is not necessarily to their benefit in the long term, because platforms typically introduce new algorithmic measures to manage these. Therefore, sustaining influence both in the immediate sense as well as in terms of shaping societal perspectives or encouraging regulatory intervention continues to remain a key challenge. So some quick takeaways. I guess from a theoretical sense, the conceptualization of the grassroots voice mechanism, it expands worker voice in non-standard employment. It expands understanding of worker voice in non-standard work arrangements, where by shifting the to date discourse on voice beyond the confines of the organization, it kind of also contributes to HRM's rethinking of HRM's boundaries. And this, I suppose, is valuable given the increasing prevalence of both algorithmic management and non-traditional work arrangements, and their kind of inevitable impact on traditional workplaces. Then equally, we see that increasing diversification trends in the workforce alongside individual work environment and regulatory factors, they pose major obstacles for sustained influence that workers kind of manage to gain from, sporadic expressions of voice. And these then highlight that worker capacities are not uniform, which is, from a regulatory standpoint, really important to note. Another aspect is that given the evidence of uneven adoption of voice structures by platforms themselves, which is something that one should question as to what is their motive behind doing that. But, implications from an organizational standpoint then are, it's quite compelling with regards to their, that they should proactively, engage and embrace these new voice channels and alternate worker representation structures, because it could offer platforms with more flexibility. It could be more cost effective way and collaborative for them to access, get access to worker inputs and address their concerns while, having to engage with the governance costs associated with traditional unionization. And of course, then from a reputation standpoint and brand image, they could come across as being a bit more inclusive and capable of, I guess, balancing business objectives with worker interests, which could then differentiate them from other competing platforms and their approaches. The other thing is that when you consider the range of actions, both individual and collective, that I was talking about just a second ago, through which workers draw attention to themselves or try to make themselves heard. Uh, um, and you see the platforms are continuously trying to explore, reconfigure, implement novel mechanisms to constrain their actions. Now, to do this, they incur huge costs. And there are to continually kind of manage these acts. And so platforms could also benefit from considering and employing a more participatory approach when it comes to optimizing their algorithmic management systems. Now, with regards to the prevalence of, I guess, informal unionization, trade unions could explore partnerships or consider mergers. In the literature and historically, it's not been too successful because both have different ideological, frames that they align with. But in recent scholarship, it's showing that in some contexts, experimentation has worked, especially with regards to the platform work context. So I guess it's a great time for unions to learn, refine, renew their approaches, or even give it a thought in terms of how they might be able to collaborate and leverage grassroots activism to remain relevant and be able to still organize in this rapidly changing labor landscape. From a regulatory standpoint, then the recognition of informal unions should, I guess, be given a bit more consideration, given that workers in these kind of work arrangements naturally gravitate towards these forms of representation over traditional unions, as you've seen. And then with regards to, I guess, final thoughts on the EU Platform Work Directive. So at the EU level, the Platform Work Directive, the guidelines, it's definitely like a positive step forward and can improve the working conditions for a lot of platform workers across the EU and ensure more decent work conditions. But given the large migrant population that is undertaking this work currently, there needs to be more policies need to be a bit more bold, a bit more ambitious, that are very much at the intersection of immigration, social welfare, and employment regulation. And in my view, this then needs to go beyond employment reclassification efforts. this is quite pressing because firstly, the guidelines is quite broad, and the onus of transposing the guidelines into national law has been put on the different member states, and it is due at the end of the year. This transposition has to be done by the end of the year, both with regards to the presumption of employment, but also with regards to algorithmic management in the workplace. Towards which I think you know there needs to be clearer standards that need to be developed with regards to transparency and algorithmic decision making. I have suggestions on how a system of external audits can be put in place for platforms, and they basically have to go through these yearly mandatory audits. Also, I guess it's quite important that legal precedents be set for platform worker participation in in these algorithmic governance processes to ensure that algorithmic management systems are actually fair, they're and they're accountable, which is currently quite obscure. So with that, I am going to conclude my presentation. Thank you so much for listening to me speak for the last while.